It goes without question that we are in the era of live service games. Everywhere you look in the modern gaming landscape, there is some influence of live service somewhere. Constant updates for games, battle passes, daily and weekly rewards, item shop rotations, and massive amounts of FOMO. All in an attempt to keep you connected to that one game for many hours, days, and weeks on end. With the constant stream of new live service games coming out, it seems like this is the new direction for modern gaming. I could express my disdain for these cycles and these different games, but I would be a hypocrite because, hey, I still play Destiny 2. Rather than doing that, I wanted to ask a few questions and expose a few realities about live service games. Why do they fail? What makes a good live service game? How they are influencing design, and so much more. So let's discuss the realities of live service games. The first of these realities comes down to why live service games keep failing. And to me, I think it comes down to three key reasons that has a knock-on effect of why the game fails. Reason number one, the game loop sucks. I would argue that the most important aspect of a live service game is making the core gameplay engaging, and that overall loop something that you want to engage with for many hours. I think this is one of the main foundations that will set up the future of your game. You would be surprised how often, though, that developers miss this first critical step. Players aren't coming back day in and day out without it. You're going to be playing these games such as Warzone, Warframe, Fortnite, Destiny. All of these have a core gameplay loop that satisfies players outside of the extra FOMO and things that are injected in. If your game fails at this from the start, you're already on a slippery slope regardless of how many updates you pump into the game to try and fix it. The foundation of the house is bad and will eventually fall apart. Many games fail at getting this core gameplay loop right because they mistake getting the live service part of the game right first. They ask the question, how do we keep them invested in our gameplay systems rather than focusing on something great to play? A good example of this is looking at games that have come out in 2024 already. Helldivers 2 versus Suicide Squad. Two games that I've had experience with firsthand. On the one hand, Helldivers 2 understood the assignment. It knew what it was and what experience it was trying to offer to its players. Shooting bugs in various ways. It's very simple, but they captured the fun and didn't try to shoehorn in other elements. Then they built upon that with the other core systems in the game and added more updates, fleshing it out. Suicide Squad, on the other hand, lacked many things, but gameplay was stale and consisted of just going from rooftop to rooftop, killing the same enemies. The focus was in the wrong place. The gameplay suffered from it. You had these unique cast of characters, all relegated to using guns and one melee attack. It meant that the core gameplay loop became very stale. One focused on making the core gameplay loop good, and the other focused on how they could keep players invested in the future, and it backfired. Having a great core gameplay earns the developers the reason to keep players invested in their live service game. But this leads us right into the second reason why many live service games fail, and that is reason number two, content problems. Many games really nail the core gameplay, but the next difficult step is supplying enough content for the players to be satisfied, and you need to have plans to support the game for the next year and beyond. If we focus on the game's initial launch, the genre of a game really plays into how much content you will need to keep your players engaged. If we look at looter shooters or MMOs, you're going to need to have dungeons, you need to have raids, you're going to need to have endgame activities and loot to chase. In more PvP focused games, you need to have different modes, maps, progression systems to chase. You basically need to have different carrots for the players to always be chasing. If all goes well, then the next step from here is providing weekly and monthly updates that adds more content to the game. The reality is though, it's irrelevant how much content that you add to the game because your player base will always be asking for more. There is a graph that only gets steeper as a game becomes more popular, that naturally more players want more content to engage with. Many developers can't keep up or are simply not ready for this, which can also hurt a game's success in the future. It's also not realistic to expect every single dev team to keep up the high amount of updates compared to some of the more already established titles. I mean, Fortnite literally pulled most of their studios together to focus on mega consistent content drops, but it led to a great deal of crunch, which isn't healthy for developers and can actually hurt the quality of the product in future. There is also this tendency to disguise content drops as just main fixes for the game. Many times we've seen games launch in a broken state, missing features, they need to have quality of life, and the next update that they have, rather than it being focused on adding more content to the game, it's fixing systems in the game instead. How many times have we seen a game be in a good state a year later before they have their first big content drop? It shouldn't be that way. We shouldn't have to wait months and months and months for a game to add more content to it because they've been delayed thanks to fixing the problems with the main game. And a lot of times developers will leave content out of the game so they can have something for future releases as a buffer period. But by that point, it can be too late, and the game has already dropped off unless it's garnered some form of dedicated audience that wants the game to stay around. Ultimately, you need to keep players happy, and if a game is offering that consistency and the quality that you deserve, then it's going to be a recipe for success. This leads us nicely into reason number 3, the game just doesn't work as a live service. There are certain genres that work really well when you put them into live service. Looter shooters lend themselves in a great way because they are built upon grinding as their core loop. Destiny, The First Descendant, Warframe, and The Division are a few examples of games that work with the nature of constant updates and having enough chase for players to be involved in between updates. The problem that we have when it comes to games being put into the live service is that established IPs try to shove themselves into a genre or make themselves live service, and it just won't work. What's worse is that some developers who are experts in a particular genre are then being asked to make live service games. I hate to dunk on Suicide Squad again, but this was a prime example of this happening. Whilst in theory, many of the concepts in the game sound great. You're asking for a cast of really crazy characters that could have some fun gameplay, and the core concept sounds amazing. And we have one developer that works really well with the Arkham universe in Rocksteady. But you're asking a more traditional single-player developer to build out a live service game, which they are very inexperienced in. Add in the fact that they tried to make it a looter shooter, which just didn't work at all. Avengers also had this issue, and there was rumors of a Horizon game being made into live service, and Insomniac had this large plan for a more Spider-Verse game. To me, I just don't see how those games work within the live service structure. As their own core single-player experiences, or just games on their own, it works. The focus on turning these established IPs into a live game can really hurt the potential of these games and the IP themselves, and it also can tie really creative developers into projects that they may not be as jazzed about, and then ultimately we'd have a recipe for failure. A lot of the reason this happens, though, is because a lot of the big publishers are seeing success in other places, and they're like, why don't we make our game live service? Which has led to the state that we are currently in the games industry. It's definitely an attractive prospect to have the stable revenue of a live service game and not have to spend millions on development. It's why a lot of live service games are currently being made. But those are the 3 core issues. We have content problems, we have the game loop, and trying to make IP work where it shouldn't. But despite a lot of these games failing, many publishers are missing the second biggest reality of live service games, and that is player count problems. This reality has a few factors that influence it. The first of those being there is a finite amount of players that can be pulled into a live service game. There isn't this never-ending pool of players, and you're not going to try and get somebody that's dedicated themselves to playing single-player games all of their life to then going to jump into a live game. it means that you have to try and pull from other live service games on the market. You have to make your game good enough to entice players and, more importantly, keep them around for future updates. When you're trying to pull from other games, you are ultimately playing into the sunk cost fallacy, in which many players are already invested in one product, buying skins, expansion packs, and thousands of hours worth of progression, and you're asking players to start over in a new game, which is a pretty hard task. Your new game has to have enough content and enough promise to be able to keep players around and to get them to move over. And this is backed up by a study that we got to see in 2023, which showed 60% of playtime in 2023 was played in games that were of an average 6 years or older. So this is things like Minecraft, Fortnite, Warzone, Apex. A lot of these games have massive player bases already, and you're asking them to be moved over, especially if you're going to be making a new first-person shooter battle royale. You're going to be competing against Warzone and Apex, which is a very tall task. What it's led to is this kind of cannibalistic cycle of player bases where there's a new update that comes out, everyone moves over to this new one, then they move back to their original game, and then a new live service game comes out, people play it for a few months, and then the player base then gets spread out further and further, and then ultimately people go back to the games that they're interested in, and it's just kind of a vicious cycle. I make note of this vicious cycle because player counts play a large factor in how well a live service game does and continues to do years down the line. There will be ups and downs, but if the game starts to trend downwards too far, then it will go past the point of no return. Seeing games have a couple of thousand players, or even worse, hundreds, is tough to see, especially when it's supposed to be a game that's planning to be around for a long period of time. The best example I can give here is imagine a game that has over 500,000 players and they're all spending $20 on a new skin. Then that's an instant revenue stream that's going to be able to supply the developers to make more content, as opposed to if there's only 100 or 200 players playing the game consistently that's supposed to be a live game. There's just not going to be enough to recoup the costs of development. And that's just recouping the costs. A lot of times these big publishers want profits. This has led to the opposite effect as well. If a game becomes insanely popular, then it's unrealistic to expect a game to continue to grow indefinitely, which has led us back to the reality where there is only a finite amount of players, and I think a lot of publishers just don't realize this. Live service games don't seem to be going anywhere, at least for the immediate future. It's become one of those trends that we've seen in the past, such as battle royales, loot boxes, and many other trends that modern gaming tends to follow. My concern is that we are spending all of this time forcing FOMO and focusing on player retention, and it will dilute a lot of the upcoming games that we do get. They'll spend a lot of time making these live service games 4 or 5 years at a time, then it comes out and flops. Seeing the 15th game have a battle pass and seasonal updates is starting to become a little bit tedious, regardless of how much I like or dislike a game. It's also shown that even many years later, the big hitters still control a large share of the market, and I've yet to see a new title break into that select group and stay there. But this leads me to the question, are live service games bad for the industry? I would say yes, but only when everyone is trying to do the same thing. Games like Warframe, Destiny, Fortnite all have their place, but an over-reliance on making these types of games has left me and many others a little jaded and tired of the same pattern. Or we can hope that this gold rush era of making live service games comes to an end real soon, because otherwise it's just going to become an even bigger problem than it already is already. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. Are live service games ruining the industry? Are you fed up of them? Do you play live service games? Let me know down in the comments. And as always, like the video if this has been insightful. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And this has been Jimbo, and I'll see you guys next time.